Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. It's Shirley with Spirit of Matter. And this is an episode about a fixed star called alkaid. And I will leave you with this beautiful background picture as I'm talking about this very deep and important fixed star that is in trine relations to Algol and has been playing a part in world events, but also in protection and prevention of certain world events, like even democide, destructions of nations, but also standing to tyranny. And this is the fixed star alkaid. So alkaid is sitting pretty in 27 degrees Virgo. Right now, Lilith, Black Moon Lilith, is approaching to conjunct alkaid, while the moon is coming to conjoin this conjunction. So the moon is still far from this conjunction, and Lilith has a little bit of at least a half a degree to kind of be closer. And this is Venus day turning into Mars night in Jupiter hour. So good time to talk about this. Alkaid is basically a star in the Big Bear, the constellation in the sky that is used for navigation. Alkaid is also associated with causing mass destruction. So the destroyer of nations. There is always, with the fixed stars, much like Algol, the big difference between what the star is doing mundanely and what the star is doing in magic. Okay? Very important. And mundanely, it is associated with a position of public counseling and public service. It is associated with being a part of either mass public service, counseling grief, mass grievances, so being associated with mass grievances, and also associated with people who are involved in planning and executing mass grievances, so on national level and international level. And it is associated also with the number 7, just like Venus and Saturn. And the card, I think the Chariot, Another myth associated with alkaid is that, I believe it is Chinese war practices. The northeast, which the Big Bear governs, is associated with an unlucky place and is unlucky in the sense that you don't point the gun there even. So if you are at war, you don't point the gun to the northeast. And now we are beginning to delve into the protective essence of alkaid. And this is where I want to give big reverence to, I think, stellar astrology for her teachings on the association to grief. Of course, to Astro King, all of the fixed star information is just excellent, especially for the mundane analysis. And to the magical magicians, Christopher Warnock, who has introduced the use of alkaid also in the sense of physical protection, and I use it for protection from assassination and for the 22nd degree. And for Hellwise Astro, who recently made an alkaid talisman and didn't get to use it, but she focuses more on processing grief and shielding psychic protection. So there is a psychic protection and processing grief, and then there is the protection from assassination, and I'm delving into and preparing to make my own alkaid talisman, and I'm learning about this. Then yes, of course, the issue of prevention of democide and prevention of genocides, and consolidating people who are going through grievance related to this, to such events, is important, and also the understanding of the connection between grief and losses, and the role of grief in certain disasters in life. I will see how much I'm able to speak about this. Grief is difficult to process and to talk about, and it's collective grief. So, let's talk about the magical associations of alkaid. Why is it protective? The crystal that I saw being used, other than obsidian, which is of course, and I would recommend you even snowflake obsidian, dependent, you need to see which do you connect more with, but also healer's gold, which I wouldn't recommend for you to necessarily buy unless you source it ethically, because it's originating in indigenous communities, shamanistic practices. The point for us when we work with crystals is to buy them from miners directly and have them as ethically sourced as we can possibly do. I know there's a great stream of magicians that only work with the raw crystal, with the this, with the that, so they probably know how to source the crystal ethically. But if it's not the case, you can still call upon, you can use metal, and you can use even notes, just a note or a sticky note, a sticker, and you can create a talisman with this if you fumigate the talisman. And even if when you don't fumigate the talisman, setting your intention with a good election is still powerful. Now for the magical. This is a different type of protection than the protection of algol. If we talk about algol as setting clear boundaries, returning to sender energies that are not meant for you. Okay, somebody says bad thing your way, you send it back, please, only to the person who actually sent this, and only to them. Okay, we're not sending generational curses back to sender. Okay, this is very important. It's not we don't start tribal wars or ancestral implications. We just, hey, if you don't want to alchemize this, then we send it back full force. And the person who sent this, they can repent, they can have, and you can add if you are so inclined to have, to pray that it would be accessible for this person to alchemize this energy and to repent and to change the ways and have the abundance accessible to them, whether it's spiritual, material, or both, so that they are making the choices in life that are choices of well-being, okay, of the support well-being. And so the herbs that are connected with alkaid. So for the herbs, we have mugwort, we have wormwood, and I would even say that you can add cinnamon. And I will talk about these herbs. So mugwort is very purifying psychically. I didn't get to work with it, so I cannot tell you too much. Wormwood is incredibly cleansing. It's great for the nervous system and the endocrine system and the hormonal system. And it is deeply purifying. It is deeply protective, and is also opening the gates to intuition. It's great to drink in tea. It's not toxic or problematic if you do it in small dosages. So it's not one of these banishing herbs that you cannot consume. And the essential oil is potent. I didn't get actually to use the essential oil. It's very potent. Why am I saying cinnamon? Cinnamon is associated with absorption of love. It's regulating sugar levels in aromatherapy, and is therefore also big abundance. So sugar level problems usually have to do with traumas that interfere with the absorption of love. Okay, where a person maybe even is loved but is not absorbing this, perhaps due to trauma, perhaps other such experiences, and or a certain way that they don't perceive themselves as loved, and or self-loving. And cinnamon is great, and is a great abundance herb. Also great for the hormonal system, to regulate overflow of blood from the third day of menstruation. And when we talk about grief stages or grief processing, it's a warming herb that can facilitate, although it's not magically associated with alkaid, it can facilitate this deep healing. I ran into more plants that I don't remember kind of right off the bat. The number 7. So the number 7 is associated with alkaid. On a mundane level, the way I have been exposed to this is, of course, the whole parade with the 7th of October, global infiltration to both Israel and the Palestine borders, with use of Israel armed forces. That should concern the world in this level of analysis, that this is a global infiltration of a national sovereignty and conduction by proxy of war crimes in Israel, and the people who appeal for war crimes that were conducted in Palestine, so in Gaza. So the number 7 appeared both on like the prophecies around this day and the drawings of Pinas, which is not alkaid associated per se. Pinas has the Osiris story, but is corresponding with the 7th letter in the alphabet, is the letter 7. And the many depictions of the use of the word Zayin as the 7th day or the 7th, and kind of the play on that, and the many appearances of the number 7. Okay, and so the 7th of October, but also the use of the 7th letter in the Hebrew alphabet, and many correspondences trying to bring in the 7th, the 7th, the 7th. Another, by the way, Iran is northeast to Israel. So for Israel to supposedly attack Iran is supposed to be unlucky, if we take kind of the Chinese war myth. So you think about this when you talk about founding a country that will arouse or instigate, or provocate a certain country, but it is unlucky to attack this country. Okay, it's very interesting play here when you talk about chaos creation and planning of mass murders and mass deaths, so war-affiliated genocides, democides, and so on. More to do with the mundane for alkaid. If you notice the WikiLeaks from 2017, of CIA documents of mass surveillance of people, and they did many developments of many surveillance type of programs, from Trojan horses to changing files to working on cell phones, on TV, on many things, working with other countries and so on. And this is called Vault 7. So 7 for Venus, 7 associated also with Saturn, but 7 is also associated with alkaid, and alkaid is associated with planning mass murders and destroying nations. And I'm not saying that the CIA is an American organization. Okay, CIA, America, different things. Yes, some believe JFK was assassinated by CIA or by other intelligences. So we must separate these things, especially when it comes to funding and so on and so forth. So I don't blame here United States. I just say that this is very interesting use of the number 7 that we want to pay attention to. Okay, now let's talk about the role of grief. So both causing mass grief and mass trauma, but also the role of grief in the decision making of the people who plan such things. If we talk about people who have been ritually tortured and abused, and molded, the personality molded to create such execution people of nations, then we're talking about a huge, tremendous grief that these people have perpetually and on purpose endured. So much so that they cannot process such grief. Then the person feels disempowered and chronically helpless, and then they bifurcate from being completely, numb, helpless, to attempting to assert their power by perpetuating the very crimes that keep them from having a connection to love. And so on a mass scale, you understand that there's genuine difficulty for these people to access love and to absorb love. This is where cinnamon can be incredibly useful. And this is definitely a herb to work with for a person that tried to get out of such a situation, or that went through severe trauma, or just the person that wants to love themselves and create abundance. Okay, it is not just for like very difficult or very painful cases. And so sometimes people cannot stand like the smell of cinnamon, so they need maybe other herbs and so on. But with aromatherapy, we see a person can sniff rose essential oil, and then they like, I don't like it, it's so floral, and then after a process, after a while, they're like, oh my God, I love this smell. They don't even remember it's the same smell. And this is amazing to see when you understand the sense. So the way that alkaid is protective from assassination, from these things, and protective for people who are in these positions of consolidating, survivors of families where the people were assassinated or murdered, or just died, then this is where we get kind of like the big bear protection that allows us to be with and process grief and have this love buffer that assists in the processing of the grieving stages or the grieving process. That doesn't have an expiration date, but also doesn't have a predictable way. Okay, for example, if I said in one culture in a funeral, then after the funeral it was a costume to drink a glass of champagne in memory of the dead. where other people, they would tear their clothes and they would cry and so on. Or there are cultures where you have 7 days and they sit in a tent and they eat and they accompany the people that are grieving. So grieving that are culturally dependent, but it's important to understand that having joyful memories, having happy moments in places where people expect you to be sad, or having happy humor. I had very weird, after I was delving into the meaning of alkaid, I was going, and it's after a war here, or during a war, but and we're just going to the bakery shop, and there was a big picture of basically the son of the place who died. And immediately, when the cashier told us that this is the son that died, immediately I had to turn my head away because I was beginning to laugh. And it's not because I was not sorry for his death. It's because this came up to me as a very kind of like unexpected way of dealing with this information. And I think what I was thinking about is the way that people would sell, like, things that help to process grief and kind of like make money over this. And the question of like making money from the grief of others came up in me, and immediately I had to turn my head because I was going to laugh for something that was not at all related. So these awkward reactions to grief is also a part of the grieving process. The people that laugh in funerals, that have a legenvol, that have unexpected, they should be sad, but they are laughing. This is, by the way, one way to look at it is dissociation and not being able to process trauma. But even without the masquerade of psychoanalysis, we can just observe this as a part of the natural phenomena of encountering grief. And while at other times you could be crying like for no reason, or something could accompany you to a great deal. And this is also part of the stages of grief, okay? You will be running into humorous situations around certain deaths and certain grievances. It's just something that is a part of life, as well as the very living presence of the people and the tremendous loss, the not being able to get out of bed part, that can accompany grievings not only about other people, but also grieving of the self, the person that you were before this trauma, for some people, okay? And so grieving of the self is also part of those grieving, the self that was, whether it's a person you lost or whether it's trauma you went through, the grieving of the loss of life that you experienced within you in the face of the trauma. And those are all a part of the grieving experiences, where when you magically work with alkaid, you are receiving a place where you can process those, where you can take the time to process grief, and even in ways that are unusual forms. So many people do not acknowledge the grieving over a pet that died, and it can be the whole world for people. And when you talk about going back to work, or you only get leave for grievances that are first relation. I remember when I was teaching a student that was K-pop fan, one of the people committed suicide in K-pop, I don't remember, and she was in grieving process, and I was English teacher, but I had to be there for her in this place because nobody was there. Not in the sense of the family. Not in the people didn't get, why does she care so much about this person? But no, these singers, they had a lot of connection, a lot of interaction with the fans, and there was a genuine connection between the fans and the people. And there was a deep connection that affected her very deeply. So these types of grievances that are not even considered by society something to grieve about. Okay? And so alkaid can assist with processing grief. And when we give this a place, when we process grief, it is shielding us. And yes, I want to mention this. I'm Me Too veteran in academia. And at this time, I got to meet various cases of various women, both from academia and workplace, and from personal life, domestic violence survivors, people that were in risk of being assassinated or domestically murdered. And in all of the cases, I saw how the processing of grief is usually sitting in the lungs. I mentioned Chinese war. Tradition is not without Chinese medicine. I'm not an expert on TCM, but it's grief is sitting in the lungs. And so, yes, Baba, it's also connected to Jupiter. And so, how the presence of grief, so there could be a parent and or a brother or sister that were not there, sometimes a parent and a brother or sister that died, maybe even died in a war. And that played a role, this grief played a role in the susceptibility of the person to be Me Too veteran. Okay? And this was how when clearing the grief, a person began to, not clearing in the sense of not feeling, but giving it a place and being shielded when you process the grief, then it decreased the susceptibility and allow the person to open up, to have a life. Okay? In the sexual organs, okay, the penis and the vagina is also important to remember. There are points that are associated with the internal organs, so the kidneys, the lungs, and so on and so forth. And it's important to bring this up because when we're doing sexuality, a sexual encounter, then those grief points that are associated with the lung, associated with the lung and heart, for vagina is closer to the uterus, okay? So the closer to the uterus part is usually also very sensitive with many vagina people. And this is where the grief is held. So if you are accessing this part again, then you find yourself crying very deeply after orgasm and the sex was willingly consensual and you were tuned with your body, then that can be the case. For the penis is the top of the penis, okay, which is the tip of the penis. And so you can imagine that the cultures were going through circumcision. I hold the belief that it's not spiritually accurate in these times to do this. It was a compromise from human sacrifice during Abrahamic religions. I'm advocate against genital mutilation of any kind, bodily mutilation. I'm not talking about like your piercings and stuff. I'm talking about things that are basically take away at the processing of grief and the sensitivity that is natural to our sexual organs and have healthy encounters. So this is also when you turn to sexuality, is very important because this does affect one another, and you can see how unprocessed grief can be associated with certain numbness and certain patterns in sexuality that are not in full alignment with what the body wants and desires, and thus are not full alignment with willing consent. Okay? I dare say that there is also sexual, how should I say it? A certain type of sexual dysfunction. It's not a dysfunction, it's protecting you. You need to give it a place to process the grief. That is associated with cases of like Me Too cases and the role of grief in those situations. Okay, so there's a deep desire for intimacy, there's deep loneliness, but also deep trauma and the fear of loss, the fear of having to go through grief again, the need to open the heart and to have a fulfilling sexual experience and intimacy, alongside with patterns around sexuality that are not healthy to the people. And this is where we encounter the role of grief in sexual boundary violations, with the sexual harassment and so on and so forth. Usually there's a deep grief to process that undergoverns the fear of rejection from the yes. Okay, so this person has lack of belief that they can experience something, and so they're blocked in this situation. And you meet with another person who's blocked in this situation. What you meant to do is to unblock this, and whether you separate or keep together, depending on other factors, but we don't have the awareness. So alkaid can help you process this grief, and thus it is entwined relations with Algol, who is associated with mundanely sexual boundary violation, victim blaming, and the rape and murder, but magically from the healing and protection from just these crimes, including the part where people are not believed. And I address this as well because sometimes the person that went through the violation, they are questioning themselves, and unfortunately this sometimes bring invalidating reactions from the environment. So when you listen to such a story, you could experience a bit of the dissociation from the truth that the victim feels, and your natural inclination can be to doubt this. So first of all, don't blame yourself, but also don't act it out, and allow yourself to process the grief upon hearing this before tending to victim blaming and other perpetuating violence and enabling violence behaviors. So you see how processing grief allows you to relate again to people in a safe attachment form. Okay, so the undermining patterns of fear of rejection, that is in essence the fear to experience grief and a loss of self, then that bring upon all these patterns can be alleviated and processed and worked through. And so on a personal level, and you are allowing connection in, and because you are allowing connection in, you feel belonging. And this, I'm so grateful. I think it is stellar astrology that gave the teaching on this. Thank you so much. This cleared it for me, because I didn't understand the connection to grief and grieving. I just accepted it, and I didn't understand the connection between this and the physical protection. So this is very useful, whether it's to war veterans, to sexual violence survivors. There's so much in common between these two groups. So much in common. I'm a great advocate at what we call PTSD, is CPTSD in nearly all cases, especially when it's war affiliated. These wars are usually not one event on Monday. It's a complex trauma for a person to go through, and even the training for them to become soldiers and warriors or guerrilla warriors. And imagine that they do this to children. Okay, they recruit children. So kidnap children. It's not recruitment. So given the place to process the grief is alleviation of the patterns to do boundary violation on an energy level, so psychic protection, and on a physical level is connected. Okay, if we have grief in the lungs and in the sexual organs, okay, close to the uterus or at the tip of the penis, and also at the feet, at the hands, at the ears, yes, of course. Then when we process this grief, then we are physically relieved. Issues of the lung. Okay, when I was looking at COVID, viral infection to do with, of course, it's medical warfare, but it's not like, oh, there is no virus, there is a viral infection. This to do with the lungs, and it's to do with tremendous grief and grieving. Because lungs is to do with grief and grieving, and so catching people when they're grieving, and this is also what we saw in the Me Too, from the testimonies. So I got to get to know people more, and to be of a position where people came to me, because I was tending to pleasure culture, so I learned about more about the how to. Yes, but I noticed there's a big vast change between people that were let's say life-threatened directly, went through something even from childhood, and people for whom this was a one-timer. They had a supportive family, and they met a person that was what they call a narcissist, which I think is outdated today, when we understand that people are ritually tortured and sacrificed, to bifurcate towards this. But there's a huge difference. So even the tips that would be given to people for how to reconnect with the sexuality, so there's a huge difference between what's the actual reality of people who were hurt in since childhood, or experienced tremendous grief beforehand. And this very gradual, this very step by step, I believe I did mention, it's a good place to mention, if we process grief, and the triangle goal is also a difficulty of people to experience orgasms, because it brings in flashbacks. So again, be very tender with yourself when you are doing such work, or using whether alcohol or alkaid talismans or petitions to reconnect with your sexuality. You definitely want to do that. You want to be super, super, super tender with yourself around this. Great tenderness, energies. Well, you can work depending. Venus, I found the Venus invisible stage to be bringing such tenderness, but it's also very, very, very deep. But it's not for everybody, because this is already depends on your natal chart. Fixed stars are a bit more universal in this case. So processing grief allows you to blend in, to get to know people, and to allow connection, not just sexual connection, any human connection, and to feel a part of humanity. This is so important when we talk about democide prevention and genocide prevention, or terror prevention. Okay? This is, and the more this is facilitated for a person, the more it is accessible for them to absorb love. And this is a process, and alkaid can definitely assist with that, and shield you from people who are on the frequency of trying to process grief, being overwhelmed from grief, and acting out certain things that are completely horrid towards themselves first, but if you are affected by this, then to shield yourself. And this is where you can also call on alkaid to shield and ward from psychic attack, and send the energy back to kind of like, you have your energy and I have mine, which unfortunately can stir up rejection. But this is a very it's kind of like a mama bear supportive energy for you to process this grief, and for them to process this grief, for instance, with alkaid. So tenderness, compassion, yes, but you still triangle goal, still a very clear boundary. Okay, it's very clear boundary, and protection for you, so that you can have self-trust again, to feel like you exist again, and process the grievances and the grief, so to allow life in again. And this is not linear process. So when we're talking about people who have placements on alkaid, these are people that deal with a lot of moral questions. They are at the position of service to society. They are consolidators in times of grief. That being said, they can gain a social position and even resources, and the temptation to cross to the other side of perpetuating mass violence is very tremendous. And so for such people, alkaid is very important to work with magically if they can, or to alleviate it throughout other planets, to make sure that they don't do this acting out. This can both harm them tremendously, because it does have implications. Okay, this is a place in Virgo, tropical Virgo, where you have to be aligning with, I like the way that this was presented. I think this was stellar astrology that presented it this way. You align with the natural high of doing the right thing. And this is where alkaid can take you, is that the natural high of doing the right thing. And it's pleasurable to do the right thing. It is. And it's reconnecting you with connection, reconnecting you with pleasure and with authenticity around the unusualness of grievance process and encountering grief. The humor, the sudden erotic desires. I've had, like in the war, people lost, many of the people they know, then they suddenly wanted to have sex with the partner and to procreate, to have babies. The death and life, and the connection and the cycle, okay, and not to be judgmental towards this, okay? Just like if there was, God forbid, sexual boundary violation, yes, there are also the confusion around what is going on that can yield orgasmic feelings, that can yield, or people having dreams, good dreams about the person that was offender, so the desire to make things good, to reconcile this in their psyche is also present. So the more we are aware of these things and we understand that this is normal, this is a valid experience is valid, even if it seems funny, unusual, and very embarrassing. You know, imagine a cashier telling me, yes, this picture, the big picture that you see, there is the son of the owner here that was kidnapped, and the first thing that you experience is like, oh my God, I have to turn my head because I'm about to laugh. This is another facet of, and of course, naturally, I don't feel jovial about him being missing. Yes, and this is a natural part of the unusual response to grief, and to de-taboo those topics culturally is very useful for the processing of grief and for the authentic process to be experienced and to be felt and to be allowed emotion, because life arrives suddenly. Okay, it's a sudden spike of life within this situation. And one people would say this is dissociation. Another way to look at it is that the enmeshment of the cycle of life, of the ending of life, and of the beginning of life, and the spark of life coming like a eureka into the experience, into the morbid experience. And so, unfortunately, there are people who try to recreate the spark of life by perpetuating violence. Alkaid can, for those who are in the place to work with it magically, can help in alleviating these urges in people and these urges of cruelty, because it allows to have shielding when you process grief, and this also can alleviate these experiences where a person processes a certain grief and then another grieving comes and another grieving comes and then a trauma comes and then somebody violates the boundaries and so on and so forth. So those can be tremendously difficult experiences. When they're shielded, when they're processing grief, then they're psychically protected and they're physically protected, so people won't try to unconsciously get to them when they are at their low. Okay, a lot of the cases that I saw when it came to, let's say, Me Too and academia, were involving some sort of grief that recently happened or that happened, and a person losing their boundaries towards the person who also experiences this grief, and acting in a way that is obsessive, that is losing the sense of internal presence, and therefore losing the sense of any boundaries towards the self and towards the other. And this is also a part of the experience of people who are the offenders, that they feel that they are the victimized because they touch at the original wounding, and that can be tremendously difficult. So when we're talking about these mass grievances, the more we work with alkaid on a collective level, magically, the less we're moving towards these mass democides, these mass genocides, these mass murders and mass grievances. And also, the more we allow certain connection to our life that is not grief-based. Yes, you can have deep connections that are grief-based and relation through to processing grief. And then when you allow it to be, and you don't judge it, then this dissipates. Okay, this dissipates. This is like, okay, you've processed something together, and if you have more connection, then that would be already on a healthy level and not on a wound level so much. Okay, which is important because growing in a nation that was indoctrinated with traumas and wars, to be relating through grief and trauma to one another, it's not a nice experience at all. And we want to be able to create good relations, that joyful joie de vivre, that yes, we can cry with each other, but we don't have to cry all our lives, okay? And we don't have to perpetuate traumas all our lives as nations. And we can process these grievances and allow in connection and a sense of belonging in humanity that prevents disaster. So if the algol type of protection is the clear no, the clear setting of boundaries, the alkaid type of protection is the blending in and feeling so part of the fabric of society that nobody would question you these weird questions that they ask strangers. Okay? And if I take, for example, a personal experience of working with alcohol, when I just moved to my village, from bus drivers to people in the village, people felt comfortable to ask me if I'm living alone. And I'm like, this is crazy. And I've worked with algols. With algol, you set a clear boundary. So no, would you let someone ask your daughter this question? And 9 times out of 10, the people themselves were not even aware that they're breaching the boundaries. It was just like a village, so people you see, in Africa, the word for stranger is mutsungu. So they see a mutsungu, so it's like mutsungu, then they want to ask you all kinds of questions. So they're curious, but they don't see that it's like, hey, what about my privacy? What about my safety? So algol is more like setting the clear boundary. And I was the mutsungu in the neighborhood, was the new person in the village. And then alkaid is blending into society. Blending into society so much so that nobody even asks you weird questions. It's a different type, okay? It's not about setting the clear boundaries, okay? It's about that you're part of people so much so that nobody would think to ask you those weird questions, because when do you ask a person a question? When they are a stranger to you. But when the person is familiar to you, you don't ask them questions, okay? Do you hang with your partner? You ask, where are you coming from? Where are you going? If you do this, you're psychopathic, right? So where are you going? So where are you coming from? So where are you this? Where are you that? This is something that you ask when you first meet a person. And this is another property of the big bear. And this is also, in this way, protecting travelers. Now, for Christopher Warnick, he quotes, I don't remember who it was that said, that if you add a powdered wolf tooth to the mix, then it also protects from thieves. I don't recommend you, unless you have ethicals. I saw places where they had ethical way to source this and they powder this themselves. I don't recommend this, but it's also protective from these things when you're traveling, because you're blending into the society itself. Whether it's the type of clothes, like they tell you, don't take your Nikon camera with the phallic lens outside when you go to visit a foreign country, especially not if it's not the wealthiest region, and so on and so forth. Like, don't put tourist on your head when you're going outside. So this is very much the energetic equivalent of this: how to blend into society, how to work. And if you think about people who are consolidating in mass grievances, so the need to be a part of the people. This is very protective of people who are in risk of assassination. Okay, people on the run. Not because they're criminals, but because they are needing to feel in belonging in society, not life-threatened in society. And so people won't ask them weird questions. They won't be targeted so much. And they can appear as a part of the crowd, and they can connect with people while the grievances are processed, and be an agent in being of service to people in times of grief, rather than the perpetuator of grief in people's lives. Therefore, alkaid is very useful for the threat of political assassination. And so this is also useful for physical, for domestic violence, and so on and so forth. Cases for like Me Too veterans. And so if you don't want this to happen, if you want to be protected, you want to process this grief, and so to blend in with the people more naturally, so you wouldn't be a target by other people that are dealing with grief so great that they perpetuate it, because it's not accessible for them to process it. And this is important for us to understand. So we don't have to be kind of like in the mercy of the hands of people who don't have access to mercy. So, and this is also on a political level. When we understand that democides are and genocides are infiltrations of sovereignty of nations and infiltrations of sovereignty of people, but first and foremost, they're infiltrations of the very existence of the people who are committing and planning these genocides. We can have the compassion allowed to process the grief and to set a very clear boundary, understanding this is good for humanity at large, and to build a world where the processing of grief is facilitated, not to perpetuating of eternal trauma until people learn how to grieve, but rather as acceptance of the cycle of life, but also creating structures that enable life. Okay, and Saturn that is slowly approaching to oppose alkaid here, is about, it's like the creation of a structure and the death of the structures that are grief-based. So sexual boundary violation, democide, genocide, ritual abuse, ritual torture, jailing of whistleblowers, threatening of people with weird stuff, you know, those things are the structures of destruction, the structures of what no longer serves, the structures that perpetuate grief rather than the structures that alleviate grief and allow life in. Okay, and so this is the great work of alkaid and the great assistance of alkaid and the great trine relations that it has with algol, that is so very important in this time, and to have more and more access for people to recovery and to healing and to processing and to living with what is grief. Okay, so it's not about, you know, you grieve a person, is they are still you know, they accompany you, that you grieve a person, and the letting go of a person or the letting go or the grieving part, you know, is it has its timing and it has its life, literally. So this allows people to process, being shielded, being guided, and being, if you have placements on this, then